The single most important lesson that I've ever learned is that the stories that you tell yourself will determine the quality of your life. We tell stories to ourselves all the time. Stories about who we are, stories about what's going to happen in the future, stories about why what happened in the past happened. We tell stories about people in the world, why other people believe what they do, and we live inside of those stories. What I want to do in this episode is walk you through why do we tell stories in the first place. We're going to talk about the neuroscience of story and what goes on in your brain whenever you hear a story. We're going to be looking at the stories that we buy into and the stories that trap us and cause us to limit our own lives and how you can change those stories. I'm going to be pulling back the curtain and showing you all of the work I've been doing on storytelling, from the research I've done in terms of writing screenplays, to the insights around business storytelling, to the work on propaganda. I want to share with you, for the first time ever, the most important things that can help you to transform the stories that you tell yourself. Get ready, this is going to be a doozy. I'll see you inside. Welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. I'm Owen Fitzpatrick, and you know that, don't you? Because you're visiting. If you're visiting for the first time, I'm Owen Fitzpatrick. Nice to meet you. But today we're going to be talking about my favorite topic, or one of my favorite topics in the world. I know you're saying to yourself, well, Owen, you say that about beliefs as well. Well, here's the thing. Stories and beliefs are connected. And today we are going to be diving into the world of storytelling. And when I say storytelling, I'm not just talking about fictional stories or myths or stories about Luke Skywalker overcoming the dark forces behind Darth Vader. Instead, that wasn't bad, was it? That was pretty good. I think that was a pretty good impression of Darth Vader. But instead, we're going to be looking at the stories we tell ourselves and why we tell those stories. And we're going to unpack the science behind storytelling in a way that I'm hoping you haven't heard it before. We're going to start off by looking at why tell stories. We're then going to look at some of the terminology around stories so I can give you some definitions. You know me and definitions. I love my definitions, I do. Then we'll look at the brain and story, the brain on story, if you will. And then we'll be tackling what are the stories that we do tell ourselves. And most important of all, how can we change them? By the end of this episode, you're going to walk away, and hopefully you'll keep on your earphones and maybe you listen to another episode, or if you're sitting watching this on YouTube, maybe you'll watch another episode maybe after this, binge watch, But at the end, you're going to walk away with ridiculously good tools to be able to make a huge difference in terms of the way in which you think by changing and transforming the narratives and the stories that you tell yourself. Yuval Noah Harari, the wonderful author of Sapiens and Homo Deus and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, among a number of other books. One of the things Harari talks about is that really so much of history can be explained through the lens of fiction. How we've created all of these fictions to be able to live by. So money is a fiction, organizations are fictions, so much religion is a fiction. And by that he means we tell ourselves stories about the way the world works. And it's not to say that religion doesn't exist or money doesn't exist or whatnot. It's more a case of that the stories we tell and the stories that we agree on build our reality. And that's a critical idea that we need to first of all understand, is that stories are pervasive in society and they're pervasive in our mind. And we build our reality through the stories that we tell and through the stories that we buy into, where we hear them from other people as well. So let's start by talking about why do we tell stories in the first place? And the first function of storytelling is that storytelling is something that came about when we were hunters and gatherers, right? So we're minding our own business, we're hunting, we're gathering, we're killing animals so that we can eat them. And when we did that, one of the things that we would look to do is to be able to learn lessons, because obviously, let's imagine you're really hungry and you're dying for tiger food. You're like, oh, if I have to eat another chicken, if I have to eat another hen, which is similar to chicken, if I have to eat, it's the same, a hen's a chicken, isn't it? Let's not get into hens and chickens. I sometimes get confused there. But if, for example, we were tired of eating, I've eaten another pig, I've eaten another cow, this is so boring. Then should you get to the stage where you go, you know what I wouldn't mind? You know what I'm kind of in the mood for? I'm in the mood for a tiger, right? And let's imagine you were too tigered. Did you get it? Tigered, too tired, tigered, with what you ate before. So you decided, I'm going to go out and I'm going to find a tiger to eat. And so you go out and you say, okay, I'm going to kill this tiger. Unfortunately, the tiger kills you. Now you're in a situation where you're like, I I need to learn the lesson. Well, you're dead. But let's say someone else was with you, they escaped. Now they need to learn the lesson and they need to spread the lesson to the rest of the tribe. So they go back to the tribe and they say, hey, Owen was eaten by a tiger, so we need to be careful. The tiger was really loud and jumped on him, and Owen approached him in this way, and this is why it didn't work. So they learned the lesson as to how to approach the tiger the next time. And this is how human evolution occurred. We learn lessons through the stories that we tell and the stories that we hear from others, which basically conceptualizes what goes on in reality. And as a result of that, it becomes the mechanism through which we guide ourselves in the world. And this is something that we need to recognize. We start to understand the way the world works based on the stories that we tell, based on the tribe that we're a part of. And it's not just the stories, it's also the narratives. It's the certain approach that the stories have that determines the way in which we interpret reality. So from our tribal's perspective, the narratives that we hear there will skew reality such that it serves the tribe. And so then we start to buy into superstition. We start to buy into perspectives of what we expect to happen. We start to look at the weather, and we expect that maybe we can do a rain dance and get the weather to come, which maybe it works. I don't know. But in many ways, we must be dancing a lot in Ireland, let me tell you that. But in many ways, what we're doing is we're formulating all these beliefs, formulating all these stories. And as a result, we're cultivating a perspective of how the world works. And this allows us to be able to share ideas with others so that we can all collectively work on specific ideas and move things forward. So stories allow us to lubricate our relationships with others such that we're able to form bonds with them, and therefore we're allowed to build more and more ideas. We're able to create more and more concepts which allow us to function in society. So in a nutshell, stories are critically important from an evolutionary perspective. And so our brains are wired for story. Our brains are used to being able to formulate stories. And therefore, when you're communicating with someone, we're much more likely to remember stories. We're much more likely to be engaged by stories. Stories are the answer. Now, in terms of specific things that stories can do, one of the things stories does, probably the most obvious, is it provides a message or a moral, the moral of the story. What's the message of the story? And whenever you tell a story, there's a sort of a presupposition in that story that there's going to be a point at some point. So it's like, so what's the point? So why are you telling me this? So there's an expectation on behalf of the listener that they're expecting you to get to a point. There's a reason why you're sharing this story. And this is based upon the premise that most stories through time, there was an expectation that they were going to serve new bits of information. They were going to serve some sort of value to transmit information to you, to transfer information, to transport information to you, such that now you have insight that allows you to be able to tackle the challenges of life. So storytelling becomes the vehicle for living. I think Robert McKee said something along those lines, but he said it much better than I ever would. So one of the important functions of storytelling is certainly the fact that we deliver messages, we offer morals. But while we're doing that, there's a couple of other things that we also do. We also create emotion. So whenever it is that you hear a story, that story isn't just going to prove a point or drill a point home or teach you something. It's also going to make you feel a certain way. So there's what Aristotle would call a pathos element to stories, which allow you to be able to impact the way in which people feel. So as soon as we hear a story, we're more likely to tap into our own emotions than we are if we just hear logic or just hear facts or just hear statistics. So it's critically important that when you're using stories, you are conscious and aware of exactly what kinds of emotions you're creating for the listener. And if you can start to generate and cultivate the kind of emotions that you want in the listener through your stories, well, now you're an even more powerful storyteller. In fact, in many ways, Hollywood, Bollywood, all works of art that utilize the power of story do so to transport people into other worlds so that they can feel. And so when you go to the cinema, the reason you choose to go to a movie is largely because you want to be impacted. You want to feel something. So maybe you go to a horror, so you want to be scared. Maybe you go to an action movie, you want to feel excited. Maybe you go to a love story, you want to feel like vomiting. I'm joking. I'm a romantic at heart, if I had one. But the point is that you go to the movies, you read a book so that you can allow yourself to escape into the stories. And stories are a wonderful vehicle for emotion. Stories also, as a third thing, they also position us in the mind of other people. So for instance, If you tell a story about something that you did before, the time you climbed this mountain or the time that you helped out this charity, if you ever hear people on first dates, usually it's like, oh my goodness, so this happened. And usually that story ends up making them look smart, generous, nice, kind, successful, a whole host of things. When people name drop, the other day I was speaking to Ricky. Oh, sorry, Sir Richard Branson. I call him Ricky. We're on first name terms. Whenever we name drop or whenever we tell stories, oftentimes one of the byproducts of those stories is we position ourselves with certain qualities in the other person's mind. So the other person sees us as, oh my goodness, Owen is so this and that and the other, because they hear the stories we tell. And that's what we try to do. And we do it sort of more unconsciously than consciously, but nonetheless, it still happens. But not only that, also when we tell stories about other people, if I tell you a story about my friend Mike, and one of the things that Mike is so nice and Mike is so generous, that shows you that generosity is something I value. So even when I'm boasting about a friend of mine and their great quality, I'm actually also telling you that that quality matters to me. So what's really important for us to understand is that we're constantly positioning ourselves in the mind of other people through stories. So stories deliver a message effectively, stories create emotions, stories position us in a certain way, and stories also dictate the reality we see. Stories literally create reality. When I tell you a story about something that you might not know about, I'm able to determine who's the hero and protagonist of that story. I'm able to determine who's the baddie in that story. I'm able to determine what's the most important takeaway from that story. Sometimes whenever I watch the news in America, and let's imagine I go to CNN and then I go to Fox News, it's like watching two different countries tell me the news on the same day. It's like I'm living in two completely different countries, and yet the thing that they have in common is, well, the names are the same of the people in government, but it's like two different realities. And one of them is very much on one side and the other is very much on the other side. And so in many ways, if all I'm doing is exposing myself, let's say, to one of those channels, then what I'm doing is I'm learning reality according to that channel. Years ago when I went to North Korea, one of the things that I experienced there was that they would share the perspective of North Korea, as they call themselves, DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And they would say, this is the way it works. They would talk about the Korean War. And they say, well, in 1950, when we were invaded by the Americans, the puppet government of the South, I mean, if you think about it, the history that we learned about the Korean War, the history they learned about the Korean War are two different realities. So whoever tells the stories rules the world. And in many ways, we need to recognize that creating reality is one of the functions of storytelling. Storytelling also allows us to collaborate. So when we all agree on a story, it means that we're able to function more effectively. We all agree on the story of money, that money has value, that the US dollar has value, that the euro has value, that the British pound has value. We're all able to formulate an agreement on that. We agree on that story. And because we all share that story, effectively what it means is we can collaborate because we have that shared understanding. And that collaboration allows us to build more things. It allows us to function, allows us to work together, allows us to find meaningful deals in the interactions that we have. Whenever we build a company, again, as Yuval Noah Harari talks about, companies are fictions. They're an agreement, a story we tell about a group of people that are working towards a particular function. But we create these sort of abstract concepts that become real because we're telling stories about what's going on. There's also the function of engaging and entertaining people. And this is a little different than just creating a certain emotion. Using stories, we're more likely to hold people's attention. So when people are listening to us, they're more likely to keep wanting to listen to us. They're not going to get bored. If you sit down with someone, imagine you sit down and you're at a party, or imagine you sit down at a party and I'm next to you and you don't know who I am. And I say to you, 94.2% of people are blah, blah, blah. And 86% of people are blah, blah, blah. Did you know that 4 out of 7... If I started just telling you all these statistics and blindsiding you with a bunch of data that you don't care about, how much fun would that party be? Imagine I cornered you and you're like, oh, get me out of here, but you're too polite. You're a people pleaser. So you're like, oh, yeah, whoa, 92.3%. Wow. It'd be a nightmare. You don't want to be hijacked by me at a party if I'm full of facts. But if I'm a good storyteller, not so bad. If I'm telling you stories that entertain you, that engage you, that you want to keep listening to, now all of a sudden, all bets are off. The greatest teachers, the greatest speakers are some of the greatest storytellers, some of the greatest comedians that are able to stand in front of a crowd for 90 minutes and just talk whatever comes into their head sometimes. They're phenomenal storytellers. And it's your ability to tell stories that doesn't just impact the way people feel, but also hooks and engages the audience effectively. So these are some of the functions of effective storytellers and some of the most important strategies that you need to be able to be aware of if you are to use stories. So always be thinking, whenever you're telling a story, it's not just about the point. It's about, how is this story positioning me? What emotion is the story creating? Is the story engaging and entertaining people? Is it allowing us to collaborate on some meaningful idea? And what is the reality I'm building for the person that I'm talking to? And that's useful not just in your personal life, but it's certainly important in the business world as well. Next, let's look at terminology. And when we talk about terminology, you know me, I love my definition, so we're going to define stuff. See, to me, the idea of defining things is it allows us to understand what we're talking about so we're all on the same page. And so a story can be defined as an account of events, real or imagined, presented in a structured or sequenced manner. Now, I'll go a little bit further in that, is that a story involves a character that experiences some form of change. And that's an important distinction, because if you go on your Instagram and you see an Instagram story and it's like a picture of like a pizza, right? That's not a story. If you have a picture like of a person eating a pizza and then the next picture is them spilling the pizza on their t-shirt, it's a terrible story, but now it's a story. Why? Because something's changed, something happened in it. So sometimes people just think, oh, it's a story, just like you put up a picture. No, it's not. A story needs to involve change. And so if a picture can showcase some change, then great, that can be a story, but otherwise not so much. A narrative refers to the broader framework or structure within which a story is told. So it encompasses not only the events of the story, but the way they're organized or presented. So the narrative is almost like its extra function is to make sure that you see the way things are. A narrative is the way in which you tell a story, not just the story itself. It's the meaning behind and the messaging behind a story. Narrative transportation is the immersive experience where one gets absorbed into a story. So when someone tells a story and you find yourself transported into that world, that's what scientists call narrative transportation. And you become deeply engaged in the story. So you start to feel the same emotions as the character, and you start to really find yourself connected with the main character and feeling what they're feeling and experiencing what they're experiencing. Suspension of disbelief is the willingness that you have to accept the premises of the fictional story as true. So it's your ability to go to James Bond or one of the Jason Bourne movies and just believe in it, right? The Fast and Furious ones, that really tests your suspension of disbelief, right? The crazy things that, I remember once they had like a car that they shot out of an airplane or something. Like literally there was an airplane carrying a car, and in midair, they were like soaring through the air. And you have to, it's a struggle. You're watching it on the movie, you're enjoying it, you're finished your popcorn, and you're looking at the movie and you're going, and you know, you're really struggling, but you're going, I gotta believe. Because if you don't believe, if you're like, oh my goodness, that's so unrealistic, but then it just spoils the movie. So you have to suspend disbelief as much as you can. And part of that should be on a great screenwriter. But when you're facing screenwriters that are just like, let's throw it out the window, flying cars, it's all fine. That's when you need to engage your suspension of disbelief. But it's one of the things that allows you to enjoy fiction as if it was real. You can suspend the disbelief that you would normally have. Neural coupling is a phenomenon that happens whenever our brain activity of the storyteller becomes synchronized with the brain activity of the people watching. A lot of research studies show that oftentimes when people are listening or watching a story, their brains sync up. So the same part of their brains light up as the storyteller and as the other people watching. Because again, if you think about it, you're all on the same page, neurologically, it seems as well. And that's called neural coupling. You also have mirror neurons, which is that whenever we watch someone else do something, we tend to, again, feel as if almost like we're doing it too. So in other words, when you see somebody being really happy or someone falling in love, part of the reason why it's so nice is because we can get a taste of it. It's almost like we fall in love with the story when they're falling in love as well. So if you've ever seen The Notebook, you ever seen The Notebook? I mean, personally speaking, I haven't seen it. I don't watch that sort of stuff. I watch like action movies and whatnot. But apparently, I heard from other people that like romance and stuff. The Notebook is such a romantic movie. It's so sweet. It's about these two lovers, and you know, they meet when they're young, and Oh, it's heartbreaking. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but oh my goodness, and the chemistry with them, and it's so beautiful. I personally, that's what they said. I mean, I've no reason to disbelieve them, no reason to suspend disbelief. But yeah, I don't know about that. But you know, the movies, like action movies, a lot of times I'll be like one of these chases and I'll be moving left and right, or boxing, I'll be moving left and right when I'm watching Rocky. That is what this experience is like, the mirror neurons. You watch someone else go through it and you go through it as well. And this is not a million miles away from emotional contagion. When one person feels something, you're more likely to catch that feeling too. And so the characters, when they're really great actors, they feel a feeling so strongly, you start to find yourself feeling that as well. And that is a powerful concept. You also have the theory of the mind. That's our ability to attribute mental states to other people. So one of the things that allows us to be able to empathize with others is our ability to be able to step into their shoes and imagine what it must be like from their perspective. So we can watch a movie about someone totally different to us, and we can still really know what it's like to imagine ourselves in their shoes, experiencing what they experience. So that's a wonderful example of a theory of mind. Just a couple more. We'll do narrative engagement. This is really a term that encompasses the neurological and psychological processes of what goes on whenever we're experiencing a story. And finally, there's the DMN, which is the default mode network. This old chestnut is our mind-wandering network, is usually when our minds wander, but it's also activated whenever we tell stories or whenever we listen to stories. So whenever we are immersed in a story, the DMN is activated and our mind goes with that experience as we start to get into the characters and we start to know what's going on with them. So there's some terms that might be useful for you when you talk to others. It's a great way to be able to show off to people, is going blah, 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 blah. Someone talks about story and you go, well, yeah, I mean, I thought the movie was good. I really did. But for me, there just wasn't enough narrative transportation, you know? I mean, I didn't feel much neurocoupling at all. In fact, if anything, I felt my mirror neurons went to sleep. And if you speak like that, you probably won't have any friends for very long. So probably don't, would be my recommendation. Trust me, I say it from experience. Anyway, let's talk about the brain on story. And again, you know how much I love neuroscience. So let's talk about what happens to the brain on story. Well, there's three chemicals that are involved whenever we tell a story. And these are, I want you to think of it like these chemical cocktails are being imbibed by the person while you're speaking to them. Imagine that their brain is carrying off a volcano and it's erupting with all of these chemicals, which are transporting them into these emotional states. So there's three chemicals I want to talk about. One is oxytocin, one is dopamine, and one is cortisol. So we'll talk first of all about oxytocin. And oxytocin is known as the love hormone, the cuddle chemical, the trust bonding hormone. It's a chemical that's released that makes us feel closer to others, makes us connect to other people. Whenever women give birth to a baby, as opposed to giving birth to something else, whenever women give birth, there's a massive amount of oxytocin that floods their system and bonds them to the baby. That's a normal part of the process. Oxytocin is something that really makes us feel more connected and feel bonded and trust other people. It's very much connected with empathy as well. It brings us closer. And so the reason for oxytocin in terms of a story is when we hear a story, we bond with the protagonist in the story. We have to connect. In other words, we have to care about that protagonist. And one of the best ways to be able to make sure that the listener to your story bonds with the character is by giving them something that the character wants and giving them the obstacle that stops them from getting it. So when you tell a story, make sure that the story sets up with the protagonist of the story wanting something but not being able to get it. Why? Because intuitively, we all know what it's like to not be able to get what it is that we want. That is what immediately makes us feel more connected and triggers the release of oxytocin in the other person's brain when you give them that. You can also trigger that release by finding some sort of commonalities that makes it easy for them to relate to the protagonist in the story. But once you've done that, now they genuinely care about what happens to the protagonist. They care about whether or not the protagonist will survive. They care about whether the protagonist will be able to get what they want. They are now concerned for the protagonist's success. That's when you then bring in your wonderful chemicals of cortisol and dopamine. So let's talk about both of them. First of all, we have the wonderful world of cortisol. And cortisol is known as a stress hormone. It's something that's released every morning when we wake up. It's a natural chemical and it's good in small doses. The problem is oftentimes we don't get it in small doses. We get it in large doses on a long-term basis. Cortisol is known as the stress hormone because it immediately makes us alert and ready for action. And unfortunately, a lot of times we're stressed about stuff that really we don't need to be able to take action for, nor do we even take that action. So therefore, the cortisol will oftentimes keep pumping out. Why we use cortisol from a storytelling perspective is every time something goes wrong in a story, cortisol is released. Now, why that's important is because if you want to keep people's attention in a story, you need cortisol. You need something to go wrong. If you tell a story where everything's going right and everything's going great, there is no change. And if there's no change, then people are not ever risking anything. And if people are not risking anything, if there's no danger in a story, who cares? There's no stakes. Why? Because nobody cares, because everything's going to be fine. Once upon a time, there was a couple and they were in love and everything was great and they loved each other and it was fantastic and they were so happy. Boring. Once upon a time, there was a couple and they were ripped apart, even though they loved each other desperately. But what happened was their families hated each other, blah, 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 blah. Oh, and then they came back together. And then they were ripped apart again. And then they came back together. And they were ripped apart again. Back and forth, back and forth. What's so critically important is we recognize that cortisol is the glue that allows us to stick to a story. It grabs our attention back. But we need to make sure that we're leveraging this particular chemical if we're to be great storytellers. And that means not just giving positive stories. So often in the business world, we'll tell a story and we'll go, we worked with this client and they were doing okay, but then we worked with them and they were doing amazing. Well, where's the problem? Where's the mistake? Where's the danger? Where's the challenge? Where's the obstacle? They need to face adversity. The main character of a great story always faces adversity. And sometimes the degree of how difficult the adversity is equivalent to how great the character becomes. So your main character is only as good as their villain. And that's something that's important to recognize. The other element, or the other chemical that we need to recognize is dopamine. And dopamine is the chemical of motivation, the motivation molecule, the molecule of more. It's the chemical that is to do with the anticipation of reward, not about reward or happiness, but the anticipation of reward. When we anticipate something positive is going to happen, our brains release dopamine. And so part of your job, whenever you do turning points in your story, is whenever things go wrong, cortisol, whenever things turn around or things might be going in a good direction, that's dopamine. And we're constantly leveraging dopamine and cortisol to keep people engaged all the way through. When the protagonist starts to achieve what they want, or it looks like they're going to achieve what they want, massive amount of dopamine, which keeps us watching. Whenever something goes wrong, cortisol, now all of a sudden it has our attention and we want that to be able to be fixed as well. So cortisol and dopamine are constantly in a dance to be able to trigger the continuous engagement and focus of your attention. And one other piece that's important to recognize about the neuroscience of story is that these chemicals also play a part in boosting our neuroplasticity. Our neuroplasticity is, in a nutshell, the way in which our brains have the capacity to change. So your brain makes connections between neurons, and the more we learn, the more connections we make. Now, those connections, our ability to change those connections, unlearn certain things, learn new things, that is triggered by things like dopamine, for instance. And so if you want to be able to improve your learning, you trigger the release of more dopamine. And what is one way to do that? Tell engaging stories. So stories become a very powerful way to be able to make sure that we're more likely to learn. Now, with all of that said, we know now these are the functions of stories. These are the different terms involved in stories. And this is what's going on in the brain whenever we hear a story. I hear you, Owen. I appreciate it. I'm with you. But I still have two questions. First question. Okay. But what are the stories we tell ourselves? I mean, this has all been about stories. You've given a lot of examples of like movies and that kind of thing, that kind of carry on. But what about me? What stories do I tell myself? And second of all, how do I change them? Like, thanks for telling me stories are a big deal. I get it. I know what's going on in the brain. But pray tell, how do I change it? What am I supposed to do? Well, let's get into it. First of all, when we look at the components of story, when we look at what is going on in the different types of stories that we tell, we have to be aware of that there's certain structures that almost seem like just naturally part of stories. For instance, there's the good versus the bad, the positive versus the negative. That's almost in all stories. that kind of dichotomy exists. We have the goodies and we've got the baddies. If you look at the most ancient stories told thousands of years ago, there was goodies and there was baddies. And in many ways, we position people that are other, people in an out group, for instance, as baddies, and we position ourselves in the in group as goodies. And that's how we sort of formulate a lot of the stories. So recognize there is the good, the bad dichotomy. Second of all, we also have causes and effects. And if you think about most stories, let's imagine we tell ourselves stories when we're a child and we look around the world and we go, oh, when I cry, that causes my mother to get upset. So we learn, or it causes me to get attention. So I cry, that causes this. You ever see a baby and they like get a little object, especially if it's a loud object, like a set of keys or something, and they start smacking on the table and you lose it with them and you're screaming at them saying, why are you there? Of course you wouldn't scream. It's a little baby, right? It's a little child. You're not going to scream at a baby. That'd be so mean. But let's imagine the child has got the keys and they're like smacking at it and they keep doing it and you see the enjoyment. The louder they make the noise, the more enjoyment. You know why that is? Because they're getting the experience. I can affect something in the world. This is them telling a story. When I do this, this causes this. That is, there's some of the earliest stories. It's like, I caused this noise to happen. And so if you think about it, a lot of the stories we tell are stories that are formulated from this notion, X causes Y. Unfortunately, a lot of them are, I've ruined my own life. I've caused this to happen in my own life. Or because my parents did this, that caused me to be this type of person. So in other words, oftentimes we lose our agency because we export the responsibility for ourselves to the outside world. And as a result of that, we start to find ourselves as victims as a result. And we'll talk about victims in a bit. But then we also have meaning. So we have this good and bad dichotomy. We've got this cause-effect notion, but we also have meaning. And meaning is really when we extrapolate from a story what something means based upon the story we're telling. So for instance, we might use metaphors. And the metaphors give us a sense as to what kinds of qualities belong to a certain type of people. For instance, if you talk about certain people as barbarians, that immediately creates enough connotation and enough emotional connotations that this particular group are savages and don't have any civilization and whatnot. There's also the idea that we use generalizations. We say all people are like this. All Irish people are extremely handsome. All Irish psychologists are so sexy. All Irish psychologists are such legends. Like truisms like that. But these are generalizations which immediately take every single person in that category and immediately create this conceptualized story that this is the way they are. It's a story about a group. So a generalization is a story about a group or a story about events or a story about a collection of something that immediately means one thing. And then we also have framing. And that is sort of the narratives that we tell, the way in which we frame how something happens, the verbs we use, the nouns we use, the way we describe it. If you take, for example, one of the wars that's happening on the planet, the way in which you describe it will let people know what side you're on, simply by the words you use. Are you calling them terrorists? Are you calling them freedom fighters? Are you calling it a government? Are you calling it a regime? The way we frame it determines the reality that we see. So it's important to recognize those components of story because I want to tap into a bunch of different types of stories that we tell. And the reason I'm bringing this up, because this is going to be one of the most important parts of this episode, I want to walk you through what these stories are so you can recognize the ones that you have. And perhaps you can identify which stories are tripping you up in your life. So the first story is the story about the future. And so what's possible in the future? When you think about what's possible in the future, when you think about what's probable in the future, when you think about what should happen in the future, those are examples of the future stories you have. So you've got the possibilities, what can happen. You've got the probabilities, what's probably going to happen. And what's probably going to happen is based upon the stories you tell yourself about other people and the stories you tell yourself about your own capabilities. That's about the probability. What's possible is much more open. What's probable is what you expect. So out of all these different variables, out of all these different stories, which one is most likely? That's the probable story. And then you've got the stories of what should happen. And that would be the ideal story, right? So noticing most of the time for our futures, you can think about your future and you can ask yourself, What are your possible stories? What are the stories about what's possible for you? What are your ideal stories? The stories of this is how it should be. And then what are the stories about the probable? What is it likely going to turn out? And if you find that the stories you tell yourself about how your future is likely to turn out is very different to how you think things should be, well, you're going to feel miserable about your future. So you need to recognize the difference between those two, because that's one of the things that we struggle with. And whenever I, as a psychologist, was working with people in therapy, one of the challenges was that they would often fall into the trap of creating a story of this is the way things should be, which was very different to the way they expected that things would become. And we need to recognize that that gap is a big problem. Next, we have stories about the past. This is usually about who's to blame, what we should regret, why this happened. And most of the time, it's just stories. Depending on the lens you go through, the reason why this happened is because of whatever you want it to be. We can find usually most things have multiple causes. There are usually a multitude of factors that leads to a particular effect. But oftentimes we fall into this singular cause idea where we go, what was the cause of that? Well, there wasn't the cause, there was a multitude. If you take World War I, what was the cause of World War I? And some people might pipe up and say, it was the assassination of the Okay, Franz Ferdinand, right? Fine. That's also the name of a band, I think. Is it the name of a band? I think it's the name of a band, like in the 90s or 2000 or so. I used to like their music. Was that the name of the song or the band or the album? Either way, the point is that this Archduke or whatever it was getting killed, that wasn't the cause, it was the trigger. But there was a multitude of causes. A lot of people, a lot of historians argue that it was inevitable that we were going to end up in a world war of some form. So it's imperative that we don't fall into the trap of assuming that there's one singular cause, but yet we do oftentimes because we like to make things simple. And our brains will look for a nice little coherent story that will tidy up the world for us as well. We sometimes then will give credibility to the thought leaders we listen to. Let's say you're on social media and you go to your favorite social media person. Let's imagine they tend to be very much on the left or very much on the right. They've got a very extreme point of view. Well, a lot of times we'll listen to their stories and we'll go, oh, the reason we're in the place we're in is because of X, Y, and Z. Politicians, when they're trying to get elected, they'll go, oh, the reason why this country is struggling is because of this, this, and this. They will tell you the story of why things are happening. And again, just because they tell you the story of why things are happening doesn't mean they're correct. Just because we're able to look back at it with hindsight, which means we might have a more accurate way of thinking about it, we also are affected by the fact that the stories we tell will influence the way in which we deal with reality in the present. So the stories that we tell about what's happened in the past, we need to reflect on. They might not be as accurate as we might like to think. That's where the notion of revisionism comes from, that we need to revise and look at those stories again with cooler heads so that we can recognize and, as Adam Grant would say, think again. Then with stories about our present, what's our current situation? Who is right? Who is wrong? What does this mean? We try to figure out what's going on in the present moment. In many ways, that's in a nutshell what your brain does. Your brain tries to make predictions about what's going to happen next. But to do so, it has to figure out what's going on now. It has to figure out, oh, am I in danger now? And so what's happening? What's right? What's wrong? What does this mean? And so our brains are constantly telling us stories, or we're constantly telling ourselves stories about what's happening to try to figure out the world, to try to figure out what's happening so that we can predict in a more effective way what's likely to happen moving forward. And so once we get aware of that, once we notice the stories we're telling ourselves in the present, then we can start to challenge those stories also. Then we have the wonderful stories about us. In a past episode where we talked about the power of your identity and beliefs and all that sort of stuff, we just covered that just a few weeks ago. Please do check that episode out. But one of the things we talked about at length was identity. And what is identity but a set of stories that we tell about ourselves, what we deserve, what we're capable of, who we are, how virtuous we are. I'm good, I'm smart, I'm right, I'm competent, I'm to be valued. All those stories that we tell ourselves these stories so that we can feel good about ourselves, so we can feel smart enough, so we can feel like we're right, so we can have a consistent identity that allows us to be okay with ourselves, so we don't have to hate ourselves or feel like there's no point to our life. What's so critical is we recognize these stories can be the very limits that trap us and prevent us from being all that we can be. And in that episode, I talk about beliefs and I talk about the importance of beginning to build an identity based on your potential as opposed to basing your identity around your current level of capability or your current abilities. So when you have the ability to change your identity and start telling yourself a story about what's possible for you, as opposed to falling into the trap, even the trap of falling into the trap of talking about what you deserve. This is the notion of entitlement. I deserve this. I deserve that. Well, in reality, if you look at it from a universe perspective, you don't deserve anything, because the world doesn't work like that. The notion of deserving something, and again, Harari talks about this, but the notion of deserving is something that's a human made up concept. A lot of the concepts we argue for are created by humans. What do you deserve? But in many ways, when you realize that this is just a narrative, it's a story you tell yourself, I tell myself the story that I deserve this, then it's no longer about that. It's about making sure that you're taking the actions that you need to take to do as good as you possibly can, to work as hard as you possibly can, and to create something better. But it needs to be something that serves you. And so the story you tell about yourself, the real question is it serving you? Is it helping you? There's also stories we tell about what's right, about what's wrong, about what's fair and what's unfair, about what's safe and what's dangerous, about what's healthy and what will make us sick. We tell ourselves stories about what should be done and what shouldn't be done. We tell ourselves stories about what we need to do and what's important for us to do, the actions we need to take. We tell ourselves stories about other people. We judge others. We tell stories about people's virtue. We tell stories about their competence. We tell stories about their character, their potential, their choices. And every time you hear someone gossip, in a nutshell, they're telling stories about other people. And some people love it. I mean, some people love the gossip, especially online. You know, whenever someone gets cancelled, there's a bunch of people there. And they always, what's hilarious is they never look joyful, right? They never say, I'm so happy, even though you know that they're so happy. Like, oh, they're so blissful, but they're writing with furious anger. But you know, behind the anger is, I'm loving this. This is the best fun I've ever had. I'm destroying someone else based upon a mistake they made. Now, sometimes, by the way, they deserve it, right? If someone really messes up and does something illegal and unethical and horrible and stuff like that, they deserve to be punished for that, for sure. But it's funny that there's some people out there that get a real kick out of decimating the character of someone based upon a small thing. And it comes down to them, their ability to tell stories. You should do that. And usually the word should is all over it. You should be ashamed of yourself. You shouldn't do that. People should be this and should be that. And they label you and all sorts of stuff. Now, I haven't been cancelled yet. Well, up to the time of this recording at least. And generally speaking, I don't think I'm important enough to be cancelled. I need to build a bigger following. One of my goals is to be big enough to be cancelled, because then, you know you've made it. But until that day comes, let me tell you this. The stories that we tell where we judge other people, that also has a byproduct in terms of what stories we're telling other people about us. So it's called virtue signaling. But the more I tell you about how Mike should be cancelled because he says something bad, the more I'm telling you, I am such a moral compass. I'm such a good human being. And I think that Mike is a terrible person. And therefore, that makes me a good person. So in other words, the stories we tell where we judge other people is not just about judging others. It's also about comparing ourselves. And this is where the good and evil comes in. For them to be evil, we need to be good. We're the forebearers of good. They're the ones of bad. And that's an interesting dichotomy that we need to recognize. And then there's also stories about societal structures. There's ideologies, all that sort of stuff. And these kind of stories we tell dictate the way in which we express ourselves in the world. And so we then formulate a sort of a entire hypothesis about the world. And that's formed from all of these stories that we tell that are unifying our perspectives and pointing our fingers at the baddies out there on the other side. So how do we change this? We've walked through a number of these different stories, but how do we actually change these stories? What can we actually do? Well, first of all, we can change the character from which we tell the story. So you've got a number of characters in a story. You got the villain, you got the victim, you got the hero, you got the guide, you got the ally, you got the antagonist, and you got the extra. So let's walk into some of this. The villain is the baddie in it in many ways, but oftentimes when I say villain, most of the time I'm referring to the fact that we will perceive ourselves as the villain. Whenever you think you're your own worst enemy, you ruin everything, your problems are entirely your fault, that's you being the villain. Whenever you believe that the reason for all your problems is other people, that's you being the victim. And whenever you want to be able to make a change, your job is to try to move from the villain or the victim into the hero by recognizing what agency you have, what you can control or influence, or what new choices you can make. And so therapy, when it's done correctly, helps people to go from villains or victims into heroes. Now, when you become a guide, that means you're then able to share with other people what lessons you can learn. So the guide telling the story would be a big emphasis on the lessons or the insights that will allow you to make the change. The ally or the antagonist, the ally would be someone who helps you and supports you. The antagonist would be someone who opposes you and prevents you. And in many ways, the antagonist is usually going to be not always a person, but oftentimes the particular problem that you're struggling with. And so whenever you tell a story from the point of view of an ally or antagonist, what you're really doing is getting yourself a little bit of space, a little bit of separation from the experience. So you're not the victim, you're not the villain, not even the hero, but you're looking on at someone that you're helping, or you're looking on at the person from the opposite perspective, from the antagonist perspective. And by doing so, sometimes that can help. If I look at my problems from the antagonist perspective, let's say someone really is ruining my life or someone's pissing me off, and I stop and I imagine telling the story from their perspective, just by understanding how they're telling themselves the narrative, that will help me then in turn to be able to deal with them better, because now I can understand them. Now I'm empathizing with them, but I first need to step into their shoes. And then there's one other person that you can look at this story from, and that's the extra. And I bring in the extra. The reason I like the extra is someone who's in a movie, for example, it's the person you don't even notice. But they're very much objective. They're in the story, but they're watching on. They're looking at the story from an outside point of view. And that gives you a bit of emotional distance, which then will help you to change things more easily because you've got a little bit more perspective. So changing the character from which you tell the story, like telling the story from different characters, can really help you to see the story quite differently. The second thing is to be able to change the ending, to make it so whatever story you're telling yourself, let's say you're telling yourself a victim story, oh my goodness, there's no way I'm ever able to do this, I'm useless, I'm rubbish. And the reason I'm useless and rubbish is because my parents, the way they brought me up, the government in this country is ruining it, blah, 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 blah. All you're doing is changing the ending. So you're going, okay, that's what's happened so far. So you're not even arguing with all the story that you're telling yourself about why you are the way you are. Instead, you're choosing to now tell yourself a new story about the future. And you're telling yourself a story that you decide how it works out. So have you ever had a shitty dream where you're like lost, I don't know, you're being eaten by a dinosaur, right? I have weird dreams. But you're being eaten by a dinosaur and the dinosaur is munching away. And then you wake up and you're like, oh my goodness. And you think to yourself, oh my goodness, that was so scary. I was being eaten by a dinosaur. Now, you don't want to keep dreaming about being eaten by a dinosaur. So one thing that you can do is that you can finish the story. This is what I always do. I close my eyes and I imagine myself mid-chew, right? So mid being eaten, and then somehow tackling the dinosaur and overcoming the dinosaur and successfully maybe eating it. Eating the dinosaur. Probably make me feel quite full, but still, I do it because when I change the ending, it resolves it for me and I no longer am likely to be negatively impacted by that story. I'm no longer likely to dream that dream. So finish the story and decide how you're going to change the ending. It's a wonderful way to transform the way you think about that. So whatever story you're telling yourself, ask yourself, how could I finish the story in a more empowering way? Next, find contradictory stories. If you're ever telling yourself a story about the fact that you'll never be able to accomplish anything, then ask yourself, what are stories which suggest that I can accomplish stuff? What are stories of other people doing this? Lots of stories of people just like me that are doing this. Role models that have successfully accomplished whatever it is that you want. Or stories where you were written off by your inner voice, but you overcame it. When you tell yourself contradictory stories, it gets you to realize that the story you're telling yourself may not be the only one. And what you're looking for is you're looking to compete that story and beat that story with a more empowering story. You can also change the belief basis, and this means looking at the story that you're telling yourself and asking yourself, what assumptions am I making in this? So really, whatever story you're telling yourself, you're saying to yourself, I'll always be single. And I'll always be single because I'm not lovable because of this. Start to take that apart and start to go, what beliefs am I assuming here? I'm assuming this, I'm assuming that. I'm assuming the other, right? I've realized I'm not lovable. Well, what? Do you have to be lovable to be in a relationship? Is that really what you want? How do you know you're unlovable? what does being unlovable mean? I mean, there's all sorts of ways we can challenge the beliefs inherent inside of that story. And the more that you challenge the beliefs inherent inside of the story, the more the story itself changes, right? You start to realize something is different. Another thing you could do is change the narrator. And this is not just change the character narrator, but you can change the narrator in the point of view of going, how would you tell this story if you were much more positive? How would you tell this story if you were much more confident? How would you tell this story if you were your boss, right? I talked in the very first episode of season 5, the inner voice episode, I talked about the boss voice. David Goggins mentions it, right? So it's this boss voice. It's like, how would you tell the story of your life, the story of this problem, if you were the boss, if you were in control, if you were not taking any sort of shit whatsoever? How would you change that story? And when you tell the story from a different perspective, it transforms the way you experience that particular event. Then there's quit the story. This means realizing it is just a story. And this is an important thing. Like whenever you recognize something is a story, it's not the truth. You start to make a distinction between fact and story, and you start to go, right, I'm useless. I'm this. I'm not good enough. And you realize that's just a story you're telling yourself, and you start to extrapolate and you go, well, what is the full story I'm telling myself? Well, I'm telling a story that I'm not good enough because of this. Recognize it's just a story. So because it's just a story, you have to keep telling it in order for you to keep believing it. So the question is, are you going to keep telling yourself a story that you know is just a story? You don't have to believe it anymore. And then finally, change the story itself. What is a new story you can tell instead? What is the story that will allow you to overcome the obstacles? How can you turn whatever limiting beliefs you have into the very thing that becomes your antagonist to overcome? What insights can you learn? What mentors can you find that will help empower you to find the solution to overcome the antagonist and overcome the monster and overcome the villain? And make it so that you make new choices and you focus on what you can do, what you can control. So you can start to build the kind of life that you want. So you can start to move in the direction that you want. So you can start to overcome the struggles that come from feeling like life sucks, from feeling like you can't get through it, from feeling like you're going to struggle, from feeling like you'll always be alone, from feeling like life isn't worth it. You take those as the antagonist that you have to overcome, and you find reasons why you can overcome, why you can become better, why you can become happier, why you can have a happier life, why the future can work. And when you do that, when you choose the new story, that is exactly what allows you to save your life. Got very intense there. Need to chill out after that. Sorry for shouting at you. I hope you're okay. If you're driving or operating machinery or you're out running, apologies. I'm going to calm down now. That was very intense altogether. I get very passionate about this. But I'm passionate about it because it matters. And so I really hope that from everything we talked about today, you've got a few insights as to what you're doing inside your head when you tell the stories that you tell, that you recognize that we all are at the mercy of the stories we tell ourselves. And you can do something different. You can realize the stories you tell yourself, they're just a story. They're told from specific perspectives, from specific voices that are triggered by specific emotions. And when you decide that you're going to take control over the stories you tell yourself, you can tell more empowering stories. You can tell stories that transform the trajectory of your life. You can tell stories that allow you to have more of what you deserve in life. You can tell stories where you believe you deserve something, even if you don't deserve anything, because nobody does. Most importantly, you can tell yourself a story that allows you to live a better life. I hope you found this useful. I hope you found this valuable. And I hope it helps you to tell better stories to you and not allowing the stories you might have heard from other people when you were growing up that allows you to stay limited or locked into a frame of thinking which prevents you from being happy or prevents you from being able to achieve what you want. Instead, I want you to unlock your incredible power to tell new stories to yourself. And I hope that this episode helps you to do that. That's all from me. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you found this useful. I hope you found this valuable. And I hope that just like Luke Skywalker, when he had to make that decision, do I come with Obi-Wan Kenobi since my uncle and aunt have been murdered by stormtroopers? Spoiler alert, sorry about that. Do I make this decision that I'm going to pursue becoming a Jedi? You don't just refuse the journey like Joseph Campbell would have you do the first time. You decide, I'm going to start to go on this journey, and this journey will be the story of my life. Thanks for watching. Be well, take care, and may the force be with you too. Bye-bye.